In the heart of Pennsylvania lies Allentown, the state's third largest city. It was settled in 1762 and played a pivotal role in the Revolutionary War and Civil War. The city's population boomed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as it became a hub for silk, textile, and manufacturing industries. By the post-World War II era, however, Allentown was grappling with economic downturns and the challenges of urban poverty. These issues would continue to shape the lives of the residents in the decades to follow. One afternoon in October of 1959, the quiet life of an apartment building owner in Allentown was interrupted by the unmistakable smell of gas. As he moved towards the source of the smell, he couldn't have foreseen that he was about to make a discovery as disturbing as it was heartbreaking. Behind one of the apartment doors, a tragedy would soon unfold, laying bare the invisible struggles of poverty, survival, and despair. Ruth Mae Urdanivia felt like she'd hit the jackpot the day she married Jose Urdanivia, a Peruvian diplomat. His air of refinement and worldly experiences seemed worlds away from her small-town roots in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Ruth was the typical all-American girl at the time. She had come from a good family and graduated from Allentown High School in 1935. She'd been a popular student and she always received good grades. To Ruth, Jose was a glimpse into an extraordinary life, a life of international intrigue, high society and wealth. Jose was the son of a Peruvian army colonel, educated in the boarding schools of Germany and Switzerland. The couple had met in the bustling FBI office in San Francisco, California, where Ruth had been working as a clerk. At the time, Jose had been stationed at the Peruvian consulate there. After a whirlwind courtship, they married, marking the beginning of Ruth's new life alongside a diplomat, with one foot in Peru and the other in Washington, D.C. Settling into their home in San Francisco, Ruth and Jose's family quickly grew with the birth of their 5 children: Christina, Ruth, Lucille, Louis, Anna Marie, and Carol. Jose's position as first secretary at the Peruvian consulate came with all the privileges and social invitations a young mother from Pennsylvania could never have dreamed of. They attended glamorous events in Washington, dined at the embassies of foreign dignitaries, and even shook hands with President Dwight Eisenhower and former President Harry Truman. Their life was indeed charmed, not only by wealth but also by the stability that Jose's career offered, especially in a world that was still reeling from the economic aftermath of the Great Depression and World War II. Jose's monthly salary was an impressive $600. That's about $6,000 in today's money. And it was tax-free, adding another layer of security to the family's lives. As a diplomat, Jose didn't pay US Social Security either, and for a time, it felt as though their luck would never run out. Then in 1957, Jose received a new assignment. He was to become Consul General in Yokohama, Japan, an appointment that would only enhance his already successful career. Ruth was giddy at the thought of immersing herself and the children in Japanese culture, of bustling markets and cherry blossoms, of everything exotic and unfamiliar. But tragically, fate intertwined. Jose had been suffering from heart problems for several years, and while at San Francisco Airport ready to board his flight for Japan, he collapsed. He had suffered a sudden, fatal heart attack. Ruth and the children's world shattered in an instant. The following months were a blur of grief and harsh realizations. Without Jose's salary, Ruth and the children were left almost penniless. Friends who had once welcomed them into their homes grew distant, as if death and misfortune were contagious. Forced to leave the life that she had known, Ruth packed up the family and moved back to Allentown in Pennsylvania, where they rented a cramped third-floor apartment on North 7th Street. She found work wherever she could, juggling 2 jobs to keep food on the table and the lights switched on. Ruth's children were now adjusting to a modest life. The older ones, Anna Marie, Christine and Ruth, enrolled at Sacred Heart School. Here, their academic dedication and neat, courteous manners quickly earned the admiration of the nuns and teachers. Sister Eberhard described them as above average, high praise in that time and place. She recalled that they were always neatly dressed, did their lessons diligently, and got on well with their classmates. On the surface, Ruth seemed to be coping well, but trouble was bubbling underneath. On the morning of the 14th of October 1959, Ruth Mae Urdanivia arrived at her brother, William Strawbridge, home. She was there to collect 2 of her children, 9-year-old Lewis and 4-year-old Carol Miriam, who had been staying with William and his wife. Her other children, 12-year-old Christine, 10-year-old Ruth Lucille, and 7-year-old Anna Marie, were already at home. Recently, all of the children had battled a severe cold, and Ruth told her brother that she planned to take them for a checkup at the doctor's. William had sensed Ruth's growing fatigue in recent months, but her assurance that she had things under control had kept him from pressing further. He knew that his sister was struggling to make ends meet. That's why he offered to care for 2 of her children. That evening, as night fell, Ruth moved quietly through her modest yet clean apartment, tidying up in the dim light. At about 9:30 p.m, she went into the kitchen. Her hands were trembling as she prepared a mixture of crushed sleeping tablets, about 100 in total, blended into water and sugar. She knew just how potent they were. Years ago, her late husband Jose had given her one for a toothache, and she'd slept an entire day away. Tonight, she'd allocated 22 tablets for Christine, 13 for each of the other children, and 26 for herself. Ruth went into her children's bedroom, urging them to change into their pajamas. She explained that the drink she'd prepared would soothe their cold symptoms, helping them all to rest. The children protested at the bitter taste, their face contorting as they tried to swallow it down. In a rush, Ruth returned to the kitchen, quickly stirring in orange juice to mask the bitterness. With peppermint patties to chase the drink, the children complied, each finishing their glass under Ruth's gentle but persistent encouragement. As the children climbed into bed, Ruth's heart pounded with a painful mixture of dread and a resigned calm. She returned to the kitchen and sat down. In a final act, Ruth penned a farewell letter to her father and brother. Her words were both apology and confession, with one solemn request. If any of her children survived, she wanted them to be raised by William and his wife. She finished with the heartbreaking plea, "Please understand." When she'd written the last word, she took her own glass and drank deeply. She then pressed kisses on each of her children's foreheads, whispering assurances that they would all feel better in the morning. Ruth then climbed into bed, closed her eyes, expecting the darkness to take her. But when Ruth opened her eyes, days had passed. She awoke groggy, the metallic taste of the drug lingering in her mouth and her mind in a daze. Slowly, she rose, feeling a weight in the pit of her stomach. As she passed her daughter Christine's room, she noticed Christine was lying unusually still. Stepping closer, Ruth's eyes fell on her daughter's face, now blackened and lifeless. She was beginning to decompose. A shattering realization swept over her. Christine was dead. So were the others. Ruth's body shook with the horror of her success and her survival. Overcome with despair, Ruth stumbled into the kitchen and grabbed a glass from the counter and smashed it against the sink. With the jagged shard, she tried to cut her wrists, hoping to end her torment once and for all. But even this act seemed cursed. Weak and bleeding, Ruth turned on the gas jets, letting the fumes fill the room. She lay on the cold kitchen floor and inhaled. Once she had inhaled what she believed would have been enough, she turned the valves off. She didn't want to hurt anybody else in the apartment complex. Ruth then lay back down on the floor and waited for death to finally release her. Downstairs, Arthur Peter, the building owner, noticed the unmistakable smell of gas wafting through the hallways. With a nagging sense of dread, he called the building's caretaker, Robert Schaefer, and asked him to investigate. Robert climbed the worn, creaky stairs, the odour intensifying with each step until he reached the 3rd floor, where it was almost unbearable. He followed the smell to Ruth Urdanivia's apartment, finding the door slightly ajar. Warily, he stepped inside. The apartment was still and dark. Robert switched on the flashlight, casting its beam down the quiet hallway. He called out, but received no response. Robert moved further into the apartment, the smell of gas thick in the air. As he swept the light across the first bedroom, his beam landed on something that made his heart skip. Blood pooled beneath the bed. He raised the light, illuminating the small, unmoving forms of 2 children lying beneath the covers, their skin blackened by decomposition. The sight was far too much to bear. Robert bolted from the apartment, nearly tumbling down the stairs in horror. The building didn't have a phone, so he sprinted to the nearest business that he could find, Allied Electronics, where he rushed inside, breathlessly pleading for help. Rudolph Rosetto, the store's owner, quickly grasped the gravity of the situation. He darted back with him to the apartment, determined to open a window before the gas could endanger anybody else. Rudolph hurried into the kitchen, forcing the window open. As he turned around, his eyes fell on Ruth. She was lying on the kitchen floor, unmoving, her skin pale and her breathing shallow. To his shock, however, Ruth was still alive. Within minutes, Officer George Kurtz and Samuel Entler arrived, their footsteps urgent as they found Ruth in a semi-conscious state on the floor. They kneeled beside her, pressing an oxygen mask to her face, but she weakly struggled, pushing it away as though trying to resist the life they were trying to save. Reluctantly, the officers had to restrain her, cuffing her wrists as they worked to revive her. Once Ruth was conscious, the officers then moved from room to room, bracing themselves for what lay beyond each doorway. In one room after another, they uncovered the bodies of her 5 children, each one beyond hope, beyond saving. Some of the most seasoned officers would later say that they had never seen anything so haunting. But as the investigation into why a mother would kill her 5 children unfolded, Ruth's story began to emerge. It wasn't just a scene of horror, it was the unravelling of a story marked by despair, loneliness, and a mother's heartbreaking fall from hope. After being stabilised at Sacred Heart Hospital, Ruth Mae Urdanivia sat down with police officers. Her demeanour was calm, but hollow. When questioned about what had happened, Ruth was open. She said to the officers, "I did it. I know it's a sin. If only I could have gone with them. The only regret I have is that I didn't die." Ruth went on to explain her struggles. Life had become a steady descent after her husband Jose's death. For almost 2 years she had contemplated ending it all, purchasing sleeping pills with a dark contingency in mind. If she couldn't provide a stable life for her children, she would free them and herself from the suffering. She admitted that the weight of supporting her family alone had left her desperate, isolated, and without options. With few social welfare agencies to turn to, and nearly no access to childcare, Ruth had taken on 2 jobs to keep her family afloat. Her mornings began early as she prepared her children for school, and her days stretched long, as she worked from 8 a.m. until 4 p.m. as a clerk at the same hospital that now held her in custody. In the afternoons, her children waited in the hospital's anteroom until she could bring them home. Ruth had been open with her co-workers, telling them how perfectly the hours suited her. They allowed her to be there for her children, even as she struggled to keep the family going. But the reality was harsh. Ruth's earnings barely covered the essentials, let alone rent or medical bills. Jose's family in Peru had sent small monthly payments to help with rent, but even that wasn't enough to stave off her anxiety. After her husband's death, Ruth had received a mere $250, and because Jose hadn't paid into US Social Security, she wasn't eligible for survivor benefits. The small savings that she and her husband had accumulated evaporated quickly, leaving her drowning in financial strain. She said to the officers, "I went everywhere to get help, but I couldn't get any." Ruth recounted her repeated attempts to seek aid. She said that she had applied to the Family Service of the United Fund, but she felt her marriage to a foreigner had biased them against her. The Department of Public Assistance was just as unyielding, telling her she would only qualify for help if she gave up her job, a demand that Ruth simply couldn't afford to meet. As she spoke of her children with the officers, a painful tenderness entered her tone. She stated, "They're better off now with their father. They won't have to live in a pigsty or eat inferior food. I'm tired of begging. Nobody helps a widow." Detective Aldo Candia sat down with Ruth for hours, his empathy stirred by the bleak tale that she had shared. He later described his conversation with Ruth as one that haunted him long after he left her at the hospital room. He later said, "I'll never forget it. She bared her soul to me. It turned me grey overnight." As news of Ruth's despair spread through the community, those who had known her and her children were devastated. For many, the revelation of Ruth's dire struggles felt like a personal failing. Neighbours and friends expressed disbelief that she'd been suffering silently for so long, hidden behind a composed exterior. Ruth had been a proud and private woman. Few had ever guessed that she was struggling so badly. Pastor Leo Fink of Sacred Heart, the church that Ruth had attended with her children, expressed sorrow and regret when he said, "If she needed help, if she couldn't afford to care for the children, we would have done it for her." In her everyday life, Ruth had always seemed dignified and put together, her appearance well kept and her demeanour inviting. Mary Schellenberg, a co-worker from Sacred Heart Hospital, remembered her fondly. She recollected, "You could tell she was a lady. She was meticulous and she never made mistakes. Everything she did was done with care." Ruth's children, too, were always dressed neatly, with bright eyes and cheerful spirits. After Ruth was discharged from the hospital, she was taken to court and arraigned on 5 charges of murder. Dressed in all black, she appeared dazed, and her expression was distant. Friends and family had secured her a defence attorney, Theodore Gardner. But when Ruth met him, she barely looked at him before blurting out, "I don't want an attorney." Tears began to fall as she quietly added, "If I refuse counsel, I suppose you'll have to appoint one anyway." Her resignation to her fate was clear. She seemed past any desire to defend herself. Following the hearing, Ruth was taken to Allentown Police Headquarters for booking, and then she was transferred to Lehigh County Prison. The warden, George Albright, observed her closely. He said of her, "She made it clear to me today when she came here that she was going to keep trying to take her life until she succeeds." To protect Ruth from herself, they placed her on suicide watch. Yet the prison, which was ill-equipped to handle someone in Ruth's fragile mental state, was only a temporary solution. Albright lobbied to have her transferred to a state mental hospital, where she could receive more specialised care. He was convinced that it was her only chance of stability. That evening, Ruth barely moved in her cell, sitting silently and staring into space. She refused all food and only drank a cup of coffee. Despite offers from District Attorney Paul McGinley to allow her to attend her children's funeral, Ruth never asked to go. The warden recalled, "She told me all this talk doesn't matter. My children are gone, and I'm going with them." The morning after her arraignment, Ruth was quietly transported from jail to Allentown State Hospital. Her transfer followed the recommendation of two physicians, Dr. John Boyer and Dr. Thomas Weber, who believed that Ruth needed close monitoring. In their report, they noted a chilling observation. If the opportunity presents itself, she would again attempt self-destruction. They described Ruth as coherent, with sensorium clear, although she had mentioned hearing voices during the night. The doctors remarked that while they didn't see her as criminally insane, psychiatric evaluation would be necessary to determine her true state of mind. As Ruth entered the confines of the state hospital, her 5 children were laid to rest in Sacred Heart Roman Catholic Church. A crowd of 1,200 mourners gathered to pay their respects, including classmates of the young children. The church was solemn as Pastor Leo Fink led the service, acknowledging the tragedy with words of compassion. He said to the congregation, "It's not for us to judge. The teaching of the church is not to condemn the sinner, but to condemn the sin." His voice softened as he looked down at the 5 small white caskets and said, "Many hearts have been opened by the deaths of these 5 little children. In our future lives, these angels unaware will bring us to a full realization of our purpose in life, namely, to know, love, and serve God." After the service, the children were laid to rest in a single grave at Sacred Heart Cemetery, donated by the church. Buried together in order of their ages, Louis, Carol Miriam, Christine, Ruth Lucille, and Anna Marie were lowered gently into the earth. Ruth wasn't present at the funeral, unaware of the quiet procession and the gathering of mourners who had come to bid farewell to her children. Yet days later, she began showing signs of progress at the state hospital. Dr. Howard Fiedler, the hospital superintendent, spoke of her tentative adjustment. He stated, "She's cooperating and seemed concerned about the future." He observed that Ruth appeared to be less withdrawn than when she first arrived. Her days were now shaped by the hospital's routines, and Dr. Fiedler met with her daily, carefully noting her responses and her demeanour. But her case, he admitted, was complex and elusive. He stated, "One day I believe I have a lead to the correct diagnosis, but the next, I throw it all away and start over." Dr. Fiedler explained that he would likely need 6 to 8 weeks to thoroughly understand Ruth's mental state. By February, Ruth's fate was still undecided, and her analysis at the state hospital continued. Early that month, a small but poignant gesture took place. Mr. and Mrs. John Zeigenfluss, owners of an Allentown monument firm, donated a gravestone for Ruth's 5 children. Carved in stone, the headstone depicted Jesus cradling 2 children, a tender image meant to honour the lives that were lost too soon. The top of the stone read, Urdanivia children, followed by their names, birth years, and the date that they had all died. Below was inscribed a passage from the book of Matthew which read, "Suffer the little children to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." That same month, a confidential psychiatric report on Ruth's mental state was submitted to the Lehigh County Court and the District Attorney's Office. While the details remained sealed, Dr. Fiedler provided a glimpse into the proceedings. He said, We placed our psychiatric findings in their hands. The court's next steps would depend heavily on these findings, sparking a new wave of anticipation throughout the community. Would Ruth stand trial, deemed responsible for her actions, or would she be declared mentally unfit, potentially closing the door on prosecution and opening an entirely different path? For Ruth, the outcomes were starkly different. She could either be found competent and face trial, or be ruled incompetent and either return to the state hospital or attempt to rebuild some semblance of a life outside of confinement. Then in March, however, the gravity of her situation intensified. The district attorney announced that he was pursuing 5 separate indictments, one for each of Ruth's children. If she were to stand trial, she would face not just 1, but 5 consecutive trials. Each would be an excruciating retelling of her actions and a direct reckoning with the loss of each individual child. As the community absorbed the news, many wondered what justice would look like for Ruth, a grieving mother, now branded a murderer, caught between the realms of mental illness and criminal responsibility. The preliminary hearing rolled around on the 29th of March. Ruth appeared calm and collected until the testimony about the murders began. She started to sob uncontrollably and nervously twisted the crumpled tissue in her hands. District Attorney George Joseph stated that Ruth had willfully, deliberately, and with malice aforethought murdered her 5 children. It was revealed that Ruth had indeed been ruled competent and prepared to stand trial. During the hearing, Detective Aldo Candia testified about Ruth's mindset in the aftermath of the murders. He said that she appeared to be clear and sharp as she detailed the murders at Sacred Heart Hospital the night that the bodies were found. In both a written and oral statement, he said that Ruth admitted to giving the children sleeping pills and a drink. He was asked whether he had ever questioned any of the doctors at the hospital about Ruth's mental condition before he took her statement. He confirmed that he hadn't, but he said that it wasn't necessary for an officer to ask for such a statement. It was then disclosed that when the bodies and Ruth were found, the children had already been dead for 6 days. However, Dr. Donald Stater, the pathologist, testified that he didn't do an autopsy because the bodies were much too decomposed. On the morning of the 6th of April, Ruth returned to court and was formally indicted on the 5 murders. She was charged with murder and voluntary manslaughter. Through her defence attorney, she declared that she was standing mute, something which amounts to an official plea of not guilty. As each indictment was read aloud, Ruth appeared to wince at the sound of each child's name before she began to cry. It was expected that the trial would get underway, but there was a change in circumstances. Ruth instead changed her plea to guilty to a general charge of murder. Her defence attorney, Theodore Gardner, announced the plea but said that it was against his advice, but at his client's insistence. He stated, "Her continued insistence leaves me no alternative but to request the court's permission to have the defendant enter pleas of guilty to the 5 indictments." During the earlier jury selection, it became clear that the defence was going to launch an insanity defence. They had planned on including medical testimony to show that Ruth was not mentally competent when she killed her children. Judge Henninger granted the permission, and Ruth immediately signed the pleas of guilty. The court then announced that 3 judges would hear the testimony and then determine whether Ruth was guilty of 1st, 2nd, or 3rd-degree murder in the deaths of her children. After the court hearing, Ruth was remanded to Lehigh County Prison. The next morning, she returned to court where the testimony was presented. The first witness was Dr. Donald Stater, the pathologist. He said that the dosage Ruth had given her children would always be fatal, adding that their bodies were decomposed. Another witness, Captain Aldo Candia, testified about the oral and written confession that Ruth had made. During the proceedings, District Attorney Joseph said that the psychiatrist had ruled that Ruth knew right from wrong at the time of the murders. In Pennsylvania at the time, this was the test for insanity under a new law. He argued that therefore, Ruth was fully responsible for what she had done. Defense attorney Gardner refuted this. He said that the staff at the hospital had actually determined that she wasn't responsible for the murders or her suicide attempt because of her mental condition. After testimony was presented, the three judges, James Henninger, Kenneth Koch and Henry Schreider, announced that they had found Ruth guilty of second-degree murder in the deaths of her 5 children. However, they also ruled that she had been suffering from some sort of mental illness at the time of the murders. Despite this, they said that under true point of Pennsylvania law, such mental illness would have to be above her responsibility for the crime. Ruth was then sentenced to an indeterminate term at the industrial home for women at Muncie. The judges said that her release would be left to the discretion of the authorities at the industrial home. She was returned to prison, where she remained until the 12th of April, when she was transported to begin serving her sentence. After her transfer to the industrial home for women at Muncie, Ruth settled into her new life in prison. She adapted to her surroundings by focusing on learning new skills, notably becoming proficient with IBM equipment, which allowed her to work in the prison's administrative offices. Ruth regularly met with various psychiatrists, psychologists and doctors, gradually gaining insight into her emotional struggles. These sessions marked the beginning of her journey towards understanding and controlling her own emotions, an endeavour that would shape her life in the years that followed. In 1964, Ruth applied for parole for the first time. However, after reviewing her case, the parole board decided to deny her release. Their decision rested on the assessment that there was no evidence of a change in her general makeup or her ability to control her emotional problems. They decided that Ruth would need more time before being reconsidered and established a 2-year period before she could apply again. Although her initial application for parole was unsuccessful, this period proved to be pivotal for Ruth. She continued to work on herself, reportedly responding well to therapy and exhibiting significant improvements in her emotional regulation and mental health. 2 years later, in January of 1967, Ruth was once more eligible for parole. This time, the parole board found her case more favourable. Ruth's progress in therapy was evident, and she appeared more stable and adjusted than she had been in years past. As a result, Ruth was released on parole, allowing her to step out of the prison walls and back into society. She quickly found employment at a hospital in central Pennsylvania. In July of that year, Paul Gennert, the chairman of the state parole board, commented on her progress, stating, "She's doing very well on the outside." He added that if Ruth continued to adapt positively, the parole board would consider ending her supervision sooner than anticipated. However, they retained the authority to extend their oversight until October of 1979. Over the years, Ruth continued to do well, and her parole supervision eventually ended, granting her full independence. After her parole was lifted, Ruth faded into obscurity. Her final public communication was sent to the office of her former defence attorney, Theodore Gardner. Gardner's secretary, Betty Grishotte, remembered Ruth fondly, describing her as a lovely person, really. In her letter, Ruth shared a moving statement about her plans, expressing her intention to devote her life to children. After this letter, however, Ruth ceased all contact with her attorney's office, and very little is known about her life beyond that point. Even Ruth's family reportedly had no knowledge of her life after she left Muncie. Ruth eventually passed away in 1982 and was buried in the same cemetery as her 5 children. In the decades since her case, opinions on Ruth Mae Urdanivia's story have remained deeply divided. Some believe that the sentence she received was far too lenient for the enormity of her crimes, feeling that justice wasn't fully served. Others, however, see her survival while her children died as the true punishment. Reflecting on the case, Detective Aldo Candia remarked, "I thought that the sentence was trivial. For the rest of her life, she would be condemned to come apart every time she'd hear a child laugh, see a child at play." Well, besties, that is it for this episode of Morbidology. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'd like to say a massive thank you to my newest supporter up on Patreon, Scott. This episode was a little bit different than the cases I normally cover, as it happened in the 1950s, so I am super curious to know your thoughts. Please feel free to reach out on social media and let me know if you like hearing about these older cases. I recorded this episode towards the end of November, and it's being released sometime in February. So if everything goes correctly, I should be giving birth to my baby in less than 4 weeks. So again, thank you everybody for all of the support over the past 5 years that Morbidology has run. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. Remember to check us out at morbidology.com for more information about this episode and to read some true crime articles. Until next time, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and have an amazing week.